Hey, this is Jeff Nyquist with another edition of Friends and Enemies. I'm in the United States and my co-host Alex Benesch is in Germany. Um, we're going to talk about Russian occultism and how it interlinks to everything. And perhaps the person to mention first of all is Alexander Dugin, the Russian so-called philosopher. Dugin refers to himself as a philosopher and he's accepted as such, but he's really just an instrument of Russian strategy. He's sometimes described as Putin's brain. But as we discover in his writings, Dugin wants to bring about the end of days, which is a very creepy kind of notion. And I've got a quote of Dugin about this. It's from the Fourth Political Theory. It's from his book. Dugin wrote, "If the fourth political practice is not able to realize the end of times, then it would be invalid. The end of days should come, but it will not come by itself. This is a task. It is not a certainty. It is active metaphysics. It is practice." He almost says it's magic, right?
Hmm.
It's occultism. Um, where did Dugin get this end of days thing? Well, he was part of something. The end of days was the grand objective of something called the Yuzhinsky Circle, from whence he emerged long ago. It was a circle in Russia. It was a group of Russian occultists born out of the 1960s, working to bring back the antediluvian golden age. They would follow in the footsteps of Nimrod in the construction of a Tower of Babel. In fact, Dugin has attempted to intellectually link all cultures and traditions according to the formula of what he calls traditionalism. This is kind of a borrowing from Julius Evola. Um, Only the Western tradition, debunked as liberalism, is excluded from Dugin's Russian project. According to Dugin, the Atlanticists, that's the West, must be destroyed and their territories absorbed. Okay, so
Hmm.
so this is Dugin, and of course, it's no accident that Dugin is one of the foremost voices advocating the invasion of Ukraine. He's been violently anti-Ukrainian from the beginning, and he's advocated this as part of the last war of the world island. Of course, the world island is North America, Great Britain, Australia, Japan, the West, right? And of course, the little peninsula connected to that island is Western Europe. So, but Dugin is kind of tries to appeal to traditional Christians, but he's actually an occultist. And I knew a Russian who knew him back in the 80s. He was not just an occultist, he was a Crowleyite. That is, he was a follower of Aleister Crowley, the British black magician. So maybe that is an introduction. And the fact is, Tucker Carlson, when he interviewed Putin in Moscow, actually met with Dugin in Moscow. And there's a video clip on YouTube of this glowing Alexander Dugin talking about how wonderful, how he met and agreed with Tucker Carlson. And of course, Tucker Carlson was a Grateful Dead fan. Why
Yeah.
don't you tell us about that a little bit and what that means?
Well, there are interesting studies out there from academics that look into the new right wing movement. I mean, they always call themselves the new right wing. That's been happening for decades, but it's besides the point. It's these new right wing guys getting into psychedelic drugs, and so they trying to achieve a re-enchantment. Okay, so when the Enlightenment happened, the age of reason, and we figured out machines, and we figured out chemistry, and we figured out biology, we figured out what causes diseases and how to defend against it. A lot of people hated reason, and they thought of this as a disenchantment. There's also these German terms for it, the Entzauberung. Okay, so like you take the magic out of everything, or you keep people away from the magic, right? And what these occultists trying to achieve is a re-enchantment of everything. So there's the speculation out there. I think that's when, for example, the podcaster Joe Rogan talked about Tucker Carlson, because we know Tucker Carlson was a fan. Tucker Carlson was a fan of these 1960s rock bands, like the Grateful Dead. They were heavily into LSD and various occult philosophies and practices. And so the question, of course, is: did Tucker Carlson Did Tucker Carlson at some point get into psychedelics himself? Did he get into occultism himself? And when it comes to and like so many other new right wing people, the famous people we talked about, what's this guy called again? Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson has talked about these very themes: the re-enchantment. We need to get people back to the old ways, and this will make people healthy and happy and all this stuff. And when we talk about Dugin, Dugin can claim to be an Orthodox Christian, but the situation in Russia had been complicated because when Christianity was introduced in Russia, this was the Eastern Roman Empire type Christianity, and of course, not just Christianity came to Russia. Also, these ancient mystery cults came to Russia, and the people in Russia, they were already into shamanism. They were into old style paganism, all kinds of stuff. There's even influences from India and Asia, and these academics like. I have this name here, and I read his book just the other day, Christopher McIntosh. He says that the Russian language itself is close to Sanskrit to a degree. And so Dugin can claim to be in the Orthodox Christian realm, but this bleeds into all this other stuff, this older stuff that he's really interested in. At some point, Dugin was trying to he was trying to get into all sorts of occultism, even Nazi occultism, and he would try to find the common ground. He wants to create a worldwide movement. This is supposed to be cross-border, international, and he doesn't care if you're into this one particular brand or the other particular brand. He doesn't care as long as the common thread is part of it. And so that's how you get this new right-wing global occultist movement, this re-enchantment. And I have this
and
one.
Dugin is a very, Charles Upton wrote a really thick book, a great book on Dugin. And Upton was the guy that wrote this great book on UFOs called The Alien Disclosure Deception. But Upton pointed out that Dugin there's this inconsistency in Dugin because Dugin's Christianity is basically a lie. It's not honest. And it goes back to the Yuzhinsky Circle. As a political philosopher, Eric Berglund would say, you could say that he was dedicated to emanatizing the Gnostic Eschaton, right? And but this is in the sense of being a parousiastic Gnostic, that is signifying they want to bring about the second coming of Christ, only it's not really the second coming they're bringing about. It's more like Marxism. This is why Dugin, by the way, gets along with the communists, has offices in communist China, gets along with Muslims, gets along with occultists. It's because it is the destruction of being itself. It was Eric Berglund who pointed out that this idea that is behind what people like Dugin say, or like what Karl Marx says, they want to destroy the order of being itself, which is experienced by them as defective and unjust, and through man's creative power to replace it with a perfect and just order. Sounds like utopianism, sounds like Marxism. Yes. And in order to accomplish this, they have to, it's destruction. It's all about obliteration and destruction. And it also is about that when you decapitate being, you are a murderer of God, as in Nietzsche's parable of the madman, who comes out, and this is in The Gay Science. Nietzsche says, the madman comes out, throws down his lantern and says, God is dead. And then he looks at the crowd that's gathered around him and says, you have murdered God, right? Well, that's Dugin's crowd. Those are the occultists and the atheistic, nihilistic Marxists and the Nazis and so on. They're trying to obliterate being itself because they're not happy with the world. They want to be gods and start creation over with them as God.
Yeah, there's a good description here. This is from an academic, and this is really rare. I mean, I'll explain this a little bit more. It's rare to find an academic who really understands how dangerous this all is, because usually these academics, they are oftentimes very forgiving towards the esoteric, the occult, the mystery cults, or sometimes they don't want to step on anybody's toes, or they sometimes love it themselves very much. But this is from an academic who really gets it, and he says, the psychological mechanism behind this outlook is clear. Committing monstrously evil acts opposes God's will to the greatest possible extent. The perpetrator of these acts considers that such active opposition to God's will puts him on a level with God, because they involve treating God as a being who is not to be feared or obeyed. And Dugin has proclaimed his allegiance to the left-hand path of occultism, which embraces hatred of the world, immersion in evil and destruction. His sympathy for the demonic way of looking at things is manifested in his praise of the Russian serial killer Andrei Chikatilo, an artist. He called him an artist of the cosmogonic mystery, and his favorable attitude to the nuclear obliteration of the United States. So they believe we are in this bad age, the Kali Yuga. We are in the Kali Yuga, and we have to bring the new age, the new era, and we need a lot of destruction to achieve that.
Yeah, this is an ancient Hindu. The Kali Yuga is the dark age in ancient Hindu thinking. And of course, this evil, this Yushinsky circle that Dugin was a part of, and I was told they were into Crowleyism, and there were the children of rocket forces, Soviet rocket forces generals in this circle. What was it that drew them to this circle? And he pointed out it was Aleister Crowley, and this particular part in Aleister Crowley's book Magic, which actually describes the most important part of magic. And I just wanted to read this because it's rather shocking. It is chapter 12. I think this is in book 4 of Magic in Theory and Practice. And Crowley, it's called Of the Bloody Sacrifice and Matters Cognate. It is necessary for us to consider carefully the problems connected with the bloody sacrifice. For this question is indeed traditionally important in magic. Nigh all ancient magic revolves around this matter. In particular, all the Osirian religions, the rites of the dying god, refer to this. And then he goes on, those magicians who object to the use of blood have endeavored to replace it with incense. And then he says, this is no good. He says, but the bloody sacrifice, though more dangerous, is more efficacious. And for nearly all purposes, human sacrifice is the best. Mm-hmm. Then he writes, the truly great magician, capital M in magician, will be able to use his own blood or possibly that of a disciple, and that without sacrificing the physical life irrevocably. An example of the sacrifice is given in chapter 44. One last word on this subject. There is a magical operation of maximum importance, the initiation of a new aeon. Of course, this is what we're talking about, the end of days, the destruction of being. And he says, when it becomes necessary to utter a word, the whole planet must be bathed in blood. And this is absolutely chilling, that people who knew that here we have, a word. I mean, imagine a ritual sacrifice in which nuclear weapons are unleashed. Imagine this mentality and this horrible war in Ukraine where innocent people are murdered and slaughtered when the Russians focus their missiles on killing innocents. Why? There's no military purpose in destroying an apartment building. There's no military purpose in knocking down a restaurant or attacking a maternity hospital. But there is a black magical logic
reason.
To it.
And the literature on all this is difficult because you want scientific literature that is also very critical. But usually you just get one of those attributes. So you either get something that is scientific but very limp-wristed, or even very, very positive towards mystery cults and occultism. And then you get sort of the sensationalist books that make all these wild claims, but a lot of the stuff is not true. There was a time in the 1960s where you could have an instant best-selling book making things up about Nazi occultism. Now, Nazi occultism was a real thing and is very, very interesting, and it must be studied. But there were these hack authors that put out terrible books that sold a lot of copies, and so usually you get one of these types of books. It's either terrible quality, or it's scientific, but it's very forgiving.
You
and
get
it's very
the Morning
limp.
of the Magicians, for example, which is full of apocryphal, not true stories.
So here's an example. Here's an example of somebody who is just in love with the subject. This is the book. I read this yesterday. This book is called Occult Russia by Christopher McIntosh. It's fairly new, and he studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford, and he studied German language at London University, later returning to Oxford to take a doctorate in history with a dissertation on the Rosicrucian revival in the context of the German Enlightenment and Counter-Enlightenment. Wow. And so he's in love with the subject, and for a scientist, I don't think this is legit. I mean, to me, this is not legit. You need to have a very critical distance to all of this, because his descriptions are so positive. He talks about, what he's saying is almost the self-marketing of the shamans and the pagans and the esoterics and the occultists, because they always talk about how they want to improve men and create this better future. But look at Russia, and look at other places that were absolutely horrible. And these places had been horrible for such a long time. So where is all this good stuff they're creating? It's nowhere to be found. So we can pretty much say that the proof is in the pudding. The dark path, or what Dugin calls the left-hand path of occultism, seems to be the predominant path of occultism. And then you get something like this. Now, you have the English edition. I have the German translation here. This is Nicholas Goodrick Clark, The Occult Roots of National Socialism.
Yeah, I've got it here in the English version.
And so he's much more...
It's got the same cover, actually.
Yeah, it's the same. It's actually the same cover. And so this guy, he's very, very critical, of course, but only when it comes to Nazi occultism. This is from... Okay, this book was first published in 1982. First published in London. And... Mr. Clark is from a very prestigious British university, and so he's very, very forgiving when it comes to British Freemasonry, and he doesn't want to step onto anybody's toes. He's not shoving people under the bus that maybe should be shoved under the bus, because you cannot really talk about Nazi occultism without talking about German occultism, which means aristocratic occultism, and specifically some very old families that were in staggering numbers high-ranking members of the Nazi Party. So he talks about these specific Nazi characters and all that, but he's not really getting into these high-level nobility type characters who were very much into the occult, and who also had vast intelligence networks that are really difficult to reconstruct. And so this is like another example of, scientists who are, too tame, who are not really brave enough to step onto anybody's toes. Because, of course, you can talk about Nazi occultism, because these Nazis, the historical Nazis, they don't exist anymore. They are gone, so they don't have any power. They cannot hurt you. But there's so much more to it. So you just get a fraction, a tiny little window into all this stuff, and of course Dugin heavily borrowed from Nazi occultism, and some of these other Russians, they heavily borrowed from German occultism, which was...
By the way, some of the principles, and it's really, it traces back to Hermeticism. It's I likened Dugin's project to, emanatizing the Gnostic eschaton, which comes from Bergland's metaphorical use of the term Gnostic to refer to this project, because Gnostics were people who were world rejecting, right? And it has to do with Dugin's, the basis of Dugin's political philosophy, and in the human being as being being both part spiritual and part material. The human being is between the two worlds, the spiritual and the material. And that there's any doctrine that rejects one or the other. Marxism rejects the spiritual and embraces the material. Gnosticism rejects the material and embraces the spiritual. And Dugin saying correct, he basically says that correct theology, if you really look at Christianity, if you look at proper philosophy, it's an embrace of both spirit and matter, and in a proper sense. And when you reject one or the other, you create this pathology, this psychological madness. But Dugin's circle was, the Ujinsky circle was hermetic rather than Gnostic. And that means magic. That means what we're talking about with Crowley. And their aims coincided with Marxist aims, but and it was Dugin got his start in it. It's James Heiser is the biographer of Dugin, which I recommend everyone read because it's really amazing. And what he points out is that basically Dugin got recruited by the KGB because the Soviet library onto the occult was open to him. And this is a quote from Heiser, that Dugin started in his youth working in the KGB archive, where he gained access to and read large amounts of forbidden literature on Masonry, fascism, and paganism. So he was getting the occult knowledge from the KGB archives directly, right?
Yeah, I have some notes on that, because it's really interesting that Dugin was angry. Dugin was angry for a large part of his life because his father was a GRU officer, the intelligence service.
In fact, I believe he made it to the rank of general, and then I think he got demoted because of his son.
Yeah, because his son was so embarrassing, and Dugin was always very angry that sort of the communist leadership wanted to keep occultism in a small circle. They wanted to have the real good stuff, the really old stuff, and not share it. And Dugin was angry about that. And so when the wall came down, this was sort of the moment that Dugin wanted to seize. He wanted to create this mass movement that was very, very occult. But for a long time, the communists wanted to keep this in a very tight circle, which is also what the Nazis did, because this is something that people oftentimes are not aware of. And Nicholas Goodrick Clark explains this very well in the book. Now, before the Nazis took over, there was a very large scene of occult lodges, occult orders. This was a bigger phenomenon, but when the Nazis took power, they wanted to keep the really crazy stuff in a tight circle, and they made all kinds of organizations illegal because they wanted to have full control over this stuff. They wanted to incorporate elements into the SS, but this was supposed to be structured and controlled by the leadership. This was not supposed to be a free-for-all movement where everybody can have his own order and his own occult lodge. They wanted to keep this very, very tight. And Hitler, even Hitler himself, he started to talk trash about the regular folk-type occultists. He called them weak, and he called it silly, and he made all these comments. So this was supposed to keep this in a very, very narrow controlled circle.
And by the way, Hitler would make these disparaging comments about Himmler's interest in the occult in front of other people, as if to distance himself from it. But there's reason to believe that he didn't. There's a Felix Kirsten, who was Himmler's masseuse doctor, and he decided to treat Himmler to save Jews and to save Dutchmen. He was I think he was very much a lover of the Dutch, and he was a Finnish citizen. And so Kirsten treated Himmler, every time Himmler would do crimes for Hitler, he would get these horrible abdominal pains and cramps. And the only relief he would get was Kirsten's technique. But Kirsten would try to minister to Himmler's better angels And at one point, Kirsten was compelled to accompany Himmler on a trip uh, with Hitler on a train, on Himmler's train, and Himmler's train had a car in it that was all a library on religion and the occult,
Yeah.
in which it had all these books, and he was astonished at all these books on theology and the occult, and he said, "Why do you have all this here?" And then Himmler said, "Well, let me let you in on a secret. We are going to make a new religion, basically where Hitler takes the place of Jesus Christ,"
Yeah.
which is really shocking when
Yeah.
you think about
They
it,
they
and
try to.
when you see then esoteric Hitlerism that came after the war.
Yeah, and they had this whole program worked out, the Ahnenerbe, where they wanted to find or fabricate evidence that all these occult or important systems, that it was all Aryan. You know, this was all, they could claim it all. They could lay claim to all of these things, and Hitler was always about the next big thing. Now, the first thing we can tell where he got into the occult was the Ostara magazine. He collected, I think, every single issue of it, and his philosophy echoed the Ostara magazine. But by that point, when he was gaining power, or he was becoming a dictator, he had already moved on to bigger levels of initiation. So he became incredibly fascinated with the Roman Empire, and of course, places where he lived, such as Munich, or places where the rallies took place, such as Nuremberg, which is right around the corner here. This was very Roman meets Germanic, right? There's the Germanic National Museum. Now, if anybody actually visits Germany, they should go to this Germanic National Museum, because this is a mind-blowing collection of things where the Roman Empire, the mystery cults, where it blends into the Nordic, Norse mythology and the Germanics and the Vikings. It's really something else. Now, this is more grand, far more grand than the earliest stuff that Hitler had seen. You know, the Völkische lodges and all these type of groups. So he always wanted to get to the next level. And when you get to the next level, this is not something for public consumption. This is not something where.
Well, let's talk about this next level for a second when it comes to Hitler, because I think there's a parallel with Putin, and of course Mao Zedong was into the occult, which is interesting for a Marxist Leninist. There was the mentor of Hitler within the Thule Society, which was
Dietrich Eckart, or one of the others.
Dietrich Eckhart, right? That was the name. And there's a book, and I gotta recommend it because it sounds crazy, but I've read it twice, and I'm amazed, and nobody pays attention to this. Stephen F. Sage, who worked with he had this project. He worked with the Holocaust Museum here in the U.S. He wrote a book called Ibsen and Hitler, and you know what Dietrich Eckhart was famous for was he was the translator of Ibsen into German from Norwegian. Ibsen was a famous Norwegian playwright, a great Norwegian playwright. But there was this, and you mentioned Hitler's fascination with the Roman Empire. And there is a play, one of Ibsen's plays is about Julian the Apostate, right? I think it's, what is it? The Master and the Galilean, or I forget the name of the play, but it's about Julian the Apostate, who was, of course, a pagan Roman emperor amidst Christian ones on either side of him, who was going to try to peel back the Christian nature of the late Roman Empire, and this was one of Ibsen's plays. But all of Ibsen's plays apparently had occult subtext to the play. The Master Builder, Ghosts, which is about syphilis, and all of the plays. And it's very funny. What Stephen F. Sage's discovery was that in Hitler's speeches and his pronouncements, he plagiarized Ibsen. I kid you not. And he has page after page showing Ibsen. And remember Albert Speer, you talk about Hitler's
Yeah.
favorite architect. The Master Builder is about
Mm-hmm.
an architect, right? And so he shows how the themes of architecture are in this play, The Master Builder. Hitler actually tries to recreate elements in the play in his regime. And the same thing, there's the play about, I forget, it's about a scientist who discovers the water is poisoned in his town. I think the play is called, it's called Public Enemy or Enemy of the People, something like that. It's about this guy becomes the enemy. He's trying to save everybody from the poison. And you see, and Hitler makes the poison is the Jews, right? So Hitler then enacts that with the Jews being the poison, and he's going to remove the poison from the community that's poisoning the community. So every one of these Ibsen themes, and it's like he's just obsessively following these. And it's very strange that Dietrich Eckart said, because Eckart died shortly after the Munich beer hall push, he said, Hitler will dance, but we have written the music, and he is going to follow what we have set down. It's very odd. What have you heard anything about this?
Well, it's ingrained here. You can see that ingrained everywhere. I mean, when you go to a city like Ansbach, which is not far from here, which is almost where I'm from. You drive in your car through Ansbach, and there is this building complex, and it now houses the government. Various parts of the local government, and it's like this ancient gargantuan temple. And you drive with your car on the main street, and this thing goes on and on and on and on. If you build this thing today, it would probably cost north of $1 billion, or maybe several billion. This stuff is ingrained everywhere. And when Hitler employed Albert Speer, Hitler wanted to create these outrageously large buildings because he thought it would provide him with some sort of immortality. He would mention that his health was bad. Hitler didn't expect to live very long, and ultimately he didn't. And he always said that in thousands of years, people would look at these large buildings and they would remember him. But I think it was much more than just remembering him. I think he wanted to reach some sort of immortality through these buildings because he had very specific guidelines for them, the measurements, the order of things. And this is very, very sophisticated for a man from a very, very simplistic background. So that indicates that Hitler was in contact with some very serious people from the aristocracy who joined the Nazi party.
And by the way, for him to have plagiarized Ibsen in his speeches, and of course, Stephen Sage, it's not, you can't even doubt it. It's documented in Sage's book, which is what's incredible. I mean, what I'm saying sounds crazy.
Yeah.
That Hitler would, as if it was ritual magic, to play these, to actually try to conform to these plays, even to the fact that Hitler had syphilis, right? The play Ghosts is about syphilis. And so, yeah, it's just bizarre to see this play out. And the thing that amazes me is, of course, there is, through this magic, like Crowley points out, there's blood, there's killing people in order to create something that's new by destroying everything that exists. And there's this in what Hitler was doing as well, as there seems to be in Putin's doings and in Marx's ideology, or he calls it a philosophy, but in the same thing, look at Xi Jinping in China. It's crazy. They're literally destroying their own economy, and they're leading themselves into what could ultimately be a nuclear war with the United States that would basically destroy China.
Well,
but
Mao,
it's like he can't stop himself.
In my view, Mao over a couple of years, Mao pushed this gigantic occult reset button, turning China into an ancient society where you have the enlightened leadership and everybody else is a serf. Because some of these early communists in China, they thought you could do the transition in another way. You could still keep some of the economy intact. You could keep some of the businesses and have some sort of modern trade and some other modern institutions. But Mao was very, very clear on this. Everything had to be turned back. Like you turn back the clock. And the communists always claimed to do something very, very new, but they heavily borrowed from something that was very, very old. There's something here in the book by Nicholas Goodrick Clark. It's about Lanz von Liebenfels, and Lanz von Liebenfels was one of the more important known occultists back then. And so Lanz said that you can find the highest form of this occult power. You can find the highest form in the oldest aristocracy in Germany. So they had this idea of there's 10 levels of enlightenment, and the first level is the individual, and the second level is like a family, in this case a Germanic Aryan family, and then you go up the ranks, and they said that level number 8 represents the high nobility, the very old families. Level 9 was the kings, and level 10 was what they call God or whatever dark force or demon they were into. So this is sort of the hierarchy they had. And so when we look at Hitler, Hitler at some point showed a vast knowledge of the occult, and at that point he had moved far beyond the stuff he was into years earlier. And this only could have happened through knowing specific people, because you cannot find the real old stuff, the real crazy stuff, in a magazine like the Ostara that he was collecting. And so they wanted to create this new world, this new empire of Aryan, Germanic super people. Everybody else would either be dead or a slave, or working on some project. And this sort of mindset is the same mindset that you see in communism and that you see in Dugin and all the other guys. And Dugin has created this international movement, this cross-border international movement. Everything is bad now. Everything is rotten. Everything is liberal, he says, and everything is falling apart. So we all have to take part in this transformation.
And he's kind of what he's done is he's taken Islam and he's taken the traditionalism. He's taken the alt-right with whatever neo-Nazi elements there are in it, and he's all tried to create an international out of them that's opposed to the liberal West, right? And it's about this War of the World Island and the end of days. It's very apocalyptic, but it's always about destruction. And it's the destruction of the West, and it's the destruction of the institutions of the West. And Russia is viewed almost by Dugin as an instrument for destroying this positive thing that exists, and dragging it down and destroying it. It's rather interesting, and because when you look at what the Third Reich was trying to do, and what the Soviet Union and what communist China, what communism, it is a sense all one thing. And it's Voegelin who points out that all of these movements have a kind of similarity to Hermeticism. He uses Gnosticism as a kind of template, but it's Hermeticism. And he calls it, we would use the term magical thinking. There's a magical thinking that if you do these certain rituals or you do this destruction, magically some new thing's going to pop out of the ground. If you destroy the bourgeoisie, paradise is going to pop out of the ground. Or you destroy the Jews, paradise is going to drop out.
In Germany, for Germany for a long time was not a unified empire. It was sort of this patchwork of different mini kingdoms and principalities and all that stuff. And so then in the 1840s, 1850s, there was this big question: what direction is Germany going to move towards? And so you had early socialists, the early communists. You had some weird Enlightenment groups, and this was sort of a very ideological and also very religious battle. What direction to take, and many problems existed in Germany back then, and of course, these occultists use that very same argument. Everything is falling apart. We're losing the magic. We're losing the grandiosity. We have to restore all that stuff. And here, for example, this is sort of one of the only spots in the book by Nicholas Goodrick Clark about the occult roots of National Socialism. One of the few moments where the author is stepping onto some very powerful toes. He says that he talks about this order, the Ordo Novi Templi. This was one of the important organizations in Germany back then. And he says that Prince Hans Heinrich the 15th of Pless gave a lot of money to this order. Now, people can look up Prince Hans Heinrich von Pless the 15th, the families sort of that he belonged to. So very, very old families and very, very powerful families. And they gave money to these right-wing groups. And it was the time of modern anti-Semitism and all this bubbling anger that happened all over Germany. Very dangerous time. And back then, they didn't have nuclear weapons. Back then, they didn't have biological weapons. They didn't have chemical weapons. But now these occultists do. So people should take this very seriously. Okay, so in my notes, I try to sort this in. I try to sort this in a certain way. It's chronological. When we're talking about Russia. Because there are so many shamanic and pagan traditions in Russia, Siberia, the Sami people, and Scandinavia, and Putin himself seems to be interested in all that stuff. I mean, we've heard some rumblings that Putin likes to bathe in elk blood or something like that, and there's actually an ancient ritual where you are in a sort of cave, or you are standing in a hole, and there's a grid above your head, and so an animal is killed ritualistically on that metal or wooden grid, so the hot blood would pour down on you while you stand below. So we don't know exactly if Putin did that specific ritual, but it's something that Putin seems to be interested in. And Christianity was introduced into Russia in the year 988. Now, this was the Eastern Roman type of Christianity, and we can pretty much guess that also some ancient mystery cults found their way into Russian territory. But even with the general population, the old pagan stuff continued to exist. Now, there's some elements to it, like the Russian Orthodox Church. They simply turned some pagan figures into Christian saints. So they would blend the old with the old Russian stuff with the Orthodox Christianity. They would sort of merge and assemble or do what was always common in the ancient world, where you just take over a new territory and you don't tell the people that your religion is wrong. You just blend their religion with yours, and incrementally you start to change the history, or the mythological history, so everything neatly fits together. And
this is what they were trying to do by positive Christianity in Nazi Germany. Was an attempt to do this to Christianity under the Third Reich. To actually move it step by step to, and eventually the goal being to replace Christ with Hitler. I
I mean,
mean, it's astonishing to think. I mean, it would be
yeah,
glacial. They would have to
yeah.
do it very gradually. But you can see what's happened in the Protestant churches with liberation theology and social Christianity. You see it moving towards communism.
Yeah.
You see it being changed, the interpretation of the scriptures, the theology being changed.
There's a reason we have Christmas trees and we hide Easter eggs for the children. You know, this is not exactly a Christian tradition, okay? So there's a lot of stuff in Germany that was blended, so to say. And some people in Germany, they never really adopted Christianity, or they adopted it on paper. And this is something that people need to be aware of when it comes to today's Russia. Now, on paper, they say like 80% of the population is Christian, but that's on
Which is
paper.
nonsense.
That's on
Yeah.
paper. You are listed somewhere as having been baptized or whatever, but all over Russia, while this Christianity drive took place, everywhere people continued the pagan and shamanistic traditions. And sometimes, especially under communism, they had to go to the woods in seclusion to do all that because it was not allowed in public, or not to that degree. So Russia was always very, very occult. It's always been that way. It was just ebbing and flowing through time. And so yeah, the Slavs, they took things from all kinds of older sources. Even the Russian language itself is influenced by Sanskrit. Now, this is something that's very interesting to Christopher McIntosh, Mr. Oxford. He spends a whole chapter on that. So even this Indian stuff came into Russia, and Asian stuff came into Russia. He says that the biggest concentration of shamanism within Russia is among the Mongol tribes of Siberia, such as the Buryat, Tungus, and Yakut. And it says the communists didn't suppress the shamans as much as the Christian church. And but there's always a level of control, of course. The Yakut shaman Alexander Gabishev announced in 2019 that God told him that Putin was a demon. So Gabishev traveled to Moscow, but he was put in a psychiatric institution as a punishment, right? So this is how they play that game.
It sounds like he had it right, though, didn't he?
Yeah. So this is what happens to you if you violate, let's say, the old Roman law. Now, in the Roman Empire, you could pick and choose any sort of cult you wanted to be a member of, as long as you accepted the super cult of the emperor. You accepted that, and you were also part of that. But other than that, you could pick and choose for a long time what mystery cult or whatever you wanted to participate in. But the moment you started to reject the Roman emperor, that's when you got into trouble. This is with the early Christians that got into a lot of trouble when that happened.
I should note, and you're mentioning we're bringing up the Third Reich in the context of Dugin and the occult and Russian occultism that is underlying things in Russia. And it's doubly curious that members of the Ujinsky circle that Dugin came out of started calling themselves the Black Order of the SS when they were led by the philologist Yevgeny Golovin and also Yuri Mamlev, who is a Russian mystic and novelist described as, quote, a representative of the aesthetics of evil, right? So just as Putin's outward adoption of Russian orthodoxy is a disguise, so we have to think that the adoption of Russian orthodoxy by the Ujinsky circle was a disguise, if they're talking about the aesthetics of evil. And of course, this is why even the given literature about Dugin doesn't go into this Caroliist aspect of it, because so many of the members of the circle won't speak to the press, the ones that are alive. But Dugin explained in the Fourth Political Theory that the classical Marxists consistently call for insanity, and insanity is what Dugin is saying is effective. Actual insanity. Madness is part of the gender arsenal of the Fourth Political Theory. And of course, he talks about gender reversal oddly, in this fourth political circle, this is before we even got that in the US. This was one of
Mm-hmm.
Dugin's older books, which is really weird.
Oh yeah.
Gender, I think I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, or a,
Yeah, I mean,
or like feminists being
um,
women trapped in women's bodies, right?
Dugin even adopted an alter ego with the name of Hans Sievers, a reference to Wolfram Sievers, a Nazi researcher of the paranormal. Now, Wolfram Sievers was
Hmm.
managing director or Reichsgeschäftsführer of the Ahnenerbe. So they also experimented on.
You might tell people what the Ananurba was. You might.
Yeah, well, this was sort of an institutionalized attempt to discover ancient sites and ancient knowledge and to create this universal claim to territories, right? Because if you
They were
find,
looking for They were looking for
yeah,
Atlantis, which
they
they
were
thought
looking
was the
for, yeah,
homeland of the
they were
Aryans.
they
They
were
were
looking
looking in
for,
the high Himalayan plateau for some kind
yeah,
of evidence of the origins of the Aryan race, and they were looking for the Holy Grail,
yeah, they were
like
looking.
something out of Indiana Jones.
They
Yeah.
tried to find what they called Ultima Thule, like the ultimate place of origin of the Germanic Aryan race. They tried to find Hyperborea, the mystery land that nobody has apparently found yet. But they wanted to create this impression that they had claims to vast amount of land and claims to these people. And this is something that Dugin borrowed borrowed a lot, because the Nazis, I mean, as much as they took from ancient Rome, the Nazis had this obsession with race and your family. Now, the Romans didn't care so much what you looked like. The Nazis did, and this became a strategic problem for them because they treated all these people so bad that they conquered. Whereas the generals would say, shouldn't we treat these people more nicely? So they fight with us against the communists, but Hitler wouldn't have it. And there's also a strain in Russia now where they glorify the Slavic people and they call that the master race. And in this train of thought, they also think of white Westerners as the devil. Since the days of Alexander Nevsky, when he defended against the Germanic Teutonic orders, and so Alexander Nevsky became a saint-like figure in Russian mythology. So the white people are the devil. If you look at communist films, the early communist cinema, like the Alexander Nevsky movie, people can find that on YouTube these days. You can see these white, blonde, devilish knights, and when they march and when they stand around in a procession and they torch these poor Slavic people, it pretty much looks like the stormtroopers from Star Wars, the George Lucas movie. And George Lucas, by the way, actually said that he believes Soviet filmmakers had more liberty than American filmmakers. So that's
Boy.
people can find that on the web in like 10 seconds.
To underscore your point, in Dugin's fourth political theory, he says that white European males are the enemies of tradition, right? Because they're the people who have brought us liberalism. And so that white European males are the focus of evil. And he says you have to destroy whiteness and you have to destroy masculinity in this Western sense. So, and this is a quote from Dugin, we are now in this moment of postmodern re-extension and the final breaking of gender. The stages of this break are feminism, homosexuality, and sex change operations, and then transhumanity.
Mm-hmm.
That's an exact quote from Dugin. So Dugin is advocating the inversion of sex, the destruction of man, white European man, by destroying the idea of sex, by inverting sexuality, and then introducing transhumanity. And by the way, Dugin and Putin, postures as if he's for this, traditional values. But his own brain, Alexander Dugin, who's called Putin's brain, was saying years ago, 20 years ago in this fourth political theory, hey, we need to invert sexuality, which in the last 20 years is what's happened.
Yeah,
It's
and also
become
and also people
progressive.
need people need to remember this. Now, whenever there's some craziness going on in the West, like an totally out of control trans movement and all that stuff, every time there's something crazy in the West, the Russian propaganda will say that the Russian propaganda will say that this shows the evil of America and American leadership.
Yet they
But
inspired it.
yeah, but it was so, there's so much communist Russian influence in all of this. So it's basically
Oh yes.
It's Dugin's people doing this to us to a large degree. And then he says, "Oh, look how bad the West is. We have a better solution. We have this crazy occult transnationalist movement to take over the world." And even during the communist era, there was a section of the Bolshevik party. They called themselves the God Builders. This was a group led by Alexander Bogdanov, co-founder with Lenin of the Bolshevik Party, Maxim Gorky, and Anatoly Lunacharsky. So they believed that religious myths and rituals and symbols were these powerful tools that can be used for socialism. And Lenin was not a big fan of making this into a larger general movement. So apparently Lenin was a bit like Hitler, wanting to have this really crazy stuff in a tight little group. He didn't want this at this stage, at least. He didn't want this to be a bigger movement. So this was sort of the fraction in the Bolshevik leadership. Now, Bogdanov was driven out of politics, and he became obsessed with blood transfusion to prolong his life and to regrow hair. But at some point, he messed up with a blood transfusion in 1928. This didn't go so well for him. Now, this Lunacharsky, he kept a position in the Bolshevik leadership, and he became the first People's Commissar for Education in the Soviet Union. So he wanted to bring all this occult stuff into the cinema and the theater and the music, and all the Soviet art. They called it socialist realism. All this stuff was, very, very occult and also very anti-Western, anti-white people.
I should interject that the whole idea of the Bolshevik Revolution, which is having the lowest class, the proletariat, becoming the ruling class, is an inversion. Just like turning men into women is an inversion, right? Or men into women or women into men. And what is Satanism? It's you do everything backwards. You invert everything, and you pervert and you invert. And I think that that's an important point, that this is part of that this is the occult aspect of the entire Marxist project. That it is an inversion. And it logically follows that somebody like Dugin, who's really a recruited KGB official, agent, would be consciously proposing sexual inversion in one of his earlier works.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Hitler, and I think there's a clear parallel to communism as well. The thing with Hitler was that he worked with the aristocracy, the high-level aristocracy, but he thought of them mistakenly. He thought of them as weak. He thought they had lost the drive, and he especially hated the Austrian aristocracy because to him they messed up the whole Roman tradition. If you go to Austria, you go to Vienna, you see these large Roman-style temples and everything, but Austria was weak for quite a while, and so Hitler thought this new Nazi movement would bring a new level of strength and a new level of occultism, because these old-timers, he thought they had lost the drive. And I think that with communism, it was there's like a parallel to this. They believed that Russia was weak. Russia had lost its zeal for power and transformation, and so they wanted to make something really big happen back in those days. So this Lunacharsky, he became popular after his death again in the 1960s. There was a surge of enthusiasm for the occult in Soviet society. And Lunacharsky was particularly interested in the Greek mystery schools, especially the Eleusinian mysteries. And now these scientists have looked at this, and they found some objects that depict some of the things that went on in these mystery schools, but we do not have any clear text about what they were into. And they had these very strict rules. If you talked about these secrets or wrote them down and handed it to somebody who didn't have the clearance for it, this meant you would be killed. I mean, they would kill you if you betrayed those secrets. So you couldn't put this into a magazine, right? And some of the scientists, they have found fragments of psychedelic drugs in these old containers, and even in old in old skeletons, in tooth cavities. They actually found traces of psychedelic substances from a fungus, and some of these cults, they even used special type of mushrooms. So this is like LSD. This is like DMT. These alkaloids. You get onto this stuff and you have a ritual. This is gonna leave an impression on you. And some of these substances, they can permanently alter your brain. New research has shown that even when people have taken this stuff a year ago, there's still a change in them. They're still different from that one experience they had a year ago. Now, if you have a repetitive experience on these drugs mixed with these cult beliefs, that of course makes it much more much more powerful.
Yeah, and you know, it's the performing of these spooky little metaphysical things, like I think we mentioned before when we talked about Hitler. In the Third Reich, Hitler actually, before he sacrificed, the Holocaust and the killing of all these Jews and other people, he drew a magic circle around Germany in his aggression. For example, he first moved east into Poland. That was his first invasion. Then north into Denmark and Norway. Then west into the Low Countries in France. Then south into Yugoslavia and Greece. And then completing the circle by going east again against the Soviet Union. So he, in his aggression, followed a perfect counterclockwise, not clockwise, counterclockwise circle, which I've heard people say that the swastika spins clockwise, but actually, if you look at the fact that if the wind is bending back the broken cross from its twirling, it's actually moving. Hitler's swastika is moving in a counterclockwise motion, and that's the motion in which he actually moved his forces. Was this intentional, subconscious? Was some kind of demonic force guiding this process? I mean, it's bizarre, but when you look at Dugin and Dugin's horseplay with Putin, did you know that Putin claims that? Dugin claims that Putin has two bodies.
Really?
Have you heard this metaphysical
No.
horseplay? Yeah.
No.
He says that he refers to this guy Ernst Kantorovich's theory that a monarch has two bodies, and then he claims that there's a corporeal body and a mystical body, and indulging in this horseplay, he borrows from Catholic theology to draw a magic circle around Putin, and calling it, and it is sort of a black magic operation, and so Dugin tells this one interviewer, he says, this mystic body of Putin, he says, is linked with the Russian mission, with the logic of Russian history, and sometimes Putin gives the sign that he is in direct connection with this imperial dimension of Russian history and its apocalyptic dimension, which is a sacred, holy dimension of our destiny. These are Dugin's exact words. And holy, sacred, end of days, apocalyptic.
Yeah, and there's also this parallel, I think, between Hitler and Putin, because they made some really strange decisions in a military sense. So this is when Hitler's generals became frustrated because they couldn't make sense of Hitler's orders, and also when Putin came up with this plan of attacking Ukraine, and even Western American generals were commenting on it and said, this didn't make much sense from a military standpoint. Normally when you do an invasion, you need a certain size of the force, you need air superiority, you would do it like this and like that. And so there's these weird choices that Putin made and also that Hitler made. And so the only real explanation that's likely is that they are going off of some kind of an occult script, because they view that as more important as what the generals are saying. So and there's so many examples. There's so many examples of this. When Hitler was messing up the war production, with these weird orders, Albert Speer, who at that point was responsible not for the architecture, he was responsible for the war production. Speer couldn't make sense of it. He would say, this is completely wrong. This is exactly the other way around as it should have been done. What is he doing? What is Hitler doing? What is his script?
The old black magician Dietrich Eckart actually gave a hint. He said that after, this is a direct quote of Eckart, he said, after a bloody war of annihilation against the united army of the trolls, there'll be a magical transformation, right? It'll just happen. So they're going to do this war of annihilation, and all these people are going to die, and there's going to be this heap of burning bodies, but it's the united army of the trolls. And you have the same kind of logic here with Putin, threatening Europe again and again. In fact, Putin is now just eschews the idea that Russia's this innocent victim, and he's just going for it, saying, no, we're going to annihilate Ukraine, and then we're going to move on. He's basically, implied that as well. And in fact, when, if you listen to the Tucker Carlson interview, which is so fascinating, Carlson acts as if Putin wants peace, but Putin does not affirm that. He doesn't really say anything about that. And what's really extraordinary, what you brought out before about Putin, the altering the transcript when basically Tucker Carlson's trying to ask Putin a leading question, saying, well, you're innocent, right? NATO was threatening you, right? Yeah. And not only did Putin, say, oh, are we just trying to do a show here, or are we being serious? And then they removed it from the transcript. Well, not only was Tucker Carlson trying to ask a leading question to help make Putin the good guy, Putin wouldn't be the good guy.
Yeah.
He said Ukraine doesn't exist. Basically he affirmed it's a genocidal war to destroy Ukraine, which was amazing slap in the face of Carlson. Yeah. And an amazing admission that he is on this apocalyptic mission of destruction.
The setting of the interview, with Tucker Carlson and Putin, the setting was the Kremlin Palace, and the Kremlin Palace has these different grand rooms that are named after czars and people of that status. So this was, of course,
what room they were in?
No, which one was it?
They were in Molotov's office.
Really?
The guy that made the Molotov-Hitler-Ribbentrop Pact. Oh, Molotov, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union. Yeah, they were in his office when they did it.
On this, this is when Tucker was not getting the plot. Why are you saying these things for half an hour? And Putin was describing history while sitting in the Kremlin Palace, which gives the message, the visual message of this grandiosity and the tradition that goes back quite a long time. And also, when Putin was in Germany, this was I think it was in the year 2000, Putin came to the German Reichstag building, where the parliament is, in Berlin, and he gave the speech, and part of it was Russian and part of it was German, because we know Putin speaks German because he was stationed with the KGB in Germany at some point. And so he was talking about, just like with the Tucker interview, he was talking about these old czars and other figures that were tied to Russia's history and also German history, and the high-level aristocracy. This czar and that holy woman he was referring to. This is sort of what he's really into. He was talking about this in the year 2000. That's 24 years ago, and that's why he talked about this with the Tucker interview, because that's what he's into. This level of grandiosity, and it's difficult to, from a scientific standpoint, to exactly say what each czar was into, right? Because they were sending troops into war. They had serfdom, so the average Russian citizen had almost zero rights. And it was very much in the tradition of the Eastern Roman Empire and the ancient world. And so the science is very, very superficial on this, because they only talk about Freemasonry coming into Russia at some late stage in the game. And at some point, Freemasonry was banned and all that, but Freemasonry was just one group. This came out of, first Scotland and then Britain originally. But Masonry, of course, is also based on much, much older things. It's sort of in my view, Freemasons, they want to be in touch with, the ancient world, and they want to be the cutting edge. At any stage in time, they want to be on the cutting edge of things, and not miss any grand discovery. And they always want to find some old thing. They're always looking for something. When somebody wants to figure out if somebody else is a Freemason, they ask the question, "Are you a traveling man?" And if the other guy is a Mason, he will say something like, "Yeah, I traveled from west to east and from east to west again." And then the original guy has to ask, "In search of what? You're traveling in search of what?" And the other guy has to say, "In search of what was lost." They're always looking for something old so they can use it to make something new. And so the scientists are so tame on this, because they look at this from a very, very superficial standpoint. And all this occultism was always mixed with espionage at all stages of history.
What's really interesting is that Hitler and the Third Reich were anti-Masonic.
Yeah.
And so are the Russians. And that's a very interesting detail. And there is also the similarity of, give you an example, there's this Eurasianism, which a former KGB officer told me fascinated the KGB strategists back in the 1920s when Hitler was advancing Eurasianism, because you have Eurasianism in Mein Kampf, and you have it what Karl Haushofer was the German general who geopolitics, a member of the Thule Society, of course, associate of Dietrich Eckart, and a practicer a member of a Japanese secret society, I believe, who had traveled to Tibet and had some Eastern mystical knowledge. But it's interesting that according to Dugin's biographer, Dugin was using Eurasianism. He was picking this as if right up off the Nazi ground, Eurasianism, and adapting it to his fourth political theory and his battle of the world island. Right, the final war of the world island is it's a great landmass against Oceania, against the naval powers. It's like Athens versus Sparta, or what he would call it, Rome against Carthage. And he appeals that Carthage must be destroyed. This is a saying of Dugin's, and he means America when he says Carthage, by the way. And so, but there's also the Pomyat thing that Dugin was into, which is weird. Yeah. And this is what his biographer Heiser pointed out, that Pomyat is an anti-Semitic Russian organization, a Russian anti-Semite group.
Conspiracy-minded, yeah.
Really conspiracy-minded. That was during the late Soviet period, that was supported by, according to Heiser's research, highly placed individuals in the Central Committee, the KGB, and the armed forces of the USSR. And it appears that experiments were then taking place throughout the USSR, and in the 1980s, it was an attempt to integrate these far-right ideas with Marxism-Leninism.
Oh, and by the way, I mean, I did this study. I did this study of 200 years worth of conspiracy media, and one part of that was in the 80s and 90s in Germany, right? So I looked at all the important books that came out here, and what you could notice was that they were trying to combine, the East and West already. When they would always take material from America, specifically the John Birch Society, and then they would merge it with Nazi mysteries, all these post-war neo-Nazi mysteries, and of course aliens and UFOs. So you would get these John Birch Society books in America that try to appear, modern and legit and everything, but these German authors, they would literally copy whole sections of these Birch books from America and then add all this crazy German stuff to it. And we talked about this before, this interesting parallel where you take the Birch Society conspiracy literature, and then you take, stuff from the Pamyat movement and also from, older Leninism, and it's oddly familiar because the Birch Society viewed it also viewed the Gilded Age of American industrialism as a conspiracy, specifically a conspiracy that was controlled by the Rothschild, the Jewish bankers. And so this was this was sort of the similarity between the American conspiracy books and the Russian stuff, because there were many people who believed that the Western conspiracy was so bad, it was much worse to them than the USSR. And we had real life traders, real life moles, like in the Navy. This John Walker guy, he was a Bircher. He was like into the Birch Society literature, and he sold out to the Soviets because he said this when he was caught. He said he thought the USSR was far less bad than the Western conspiracy. And so
so you see, there's this synthetic attempt to merge these right-wing anti-capitalist, anti-Western themes with Marxism-Leninism because they have the same enemy. They both oppose the capitalist or liberal elite in the West. And so so that the Soviet infiltration of the right goes back to the Nazi period when they saw Hitler as the icebreaker of the revolution. And the manipulation of neo-Nazi groups throughout Europe not only continued after World War II, it's now. You look at Golden Dawn in Greece. They're united, they have this deal with the communists, and they both are supported by Moscow. Yeah. That's a very interesting kind of thing, convergence of the far right and the far left.
Nowadays, you have new orders, like these occult orders, new ones in Germany, very right-wing, and they love all that Knights Templars mystique and all of that stuff. And we have evidence that these new orders in Germany, they are pro-Russia, they're very pro-Russia, and they're also tied to the right-wing AfD party. And there was also some evidence that linked the AfD party to a man, a baron, a Baron von Fink. So he has a legit aristocratic title, or had. This old guy is now dead. He died a few years ago. But so this Baron von Fink, he may have funneled money to the AfD party, which is very pro-Russia. And so we know that. I looked at this family. The press mostly focused on that guy's father, the older Baron Fink, because he was a Nazi. But I also looked at the grandfather because he was moving in those circles in Hessen-Darmstadt, which is one of the most elite families you could get in German aristocracy. And so he got his aristocratic title from these circles and also his banking career. And these families, Hessen, the House of Hessen, it's basically the British throne, right? So there's a connection to Britain, and we know that the British aristocracy is compromised or has a weird relationship with the Russians. This is in books like War of the Windsors. They talk about Lord Louis Mountbatten and his Soviet contacts and how he messed everything up for NATO because Lord Louis Mountbatten's guy became the first head of NATO. This was Baron Ismay. And so people started to notice, British intelligence, French, Americans, the FBI, everybody noticed this Lord Louis Mountbatten guy is compromised by the Soviets. His whole family is compromised by the Soviets, and he messes everything up for NATO. So you still have these aristocratic families running around, and they're just like this guy I mentioned earlier, who was named in the book "The Occult Roots of National Socialism." This one guy, this aristocrat who funneled money into these right-wing orders, this Ordo Novo Templi, or what it was called. So it's the same thing as happening today that was happening in the 1920s and 30s. These aristocratic guys funneling money into this stuff, and now there's this weird connection with Russia. And then there's this guy. This was Vyacheslav Menjinsky. He was head of the OGPU, that was Soviet intelligence, from 1926 to 1934. He was the most important Bolshevik with occultist links. Before the revolution, Menjinsky was part of the circle around the poet and Satanist Mikhail Kutzmin, writing stuff expressing views that resembled Dugin's. So Dugin was mad because Dugin had this powerful father in the GRU, but still somebody like Alexander Dugin was not allowed into these higher levels yet, because the Soviets were keeping this stuff in a very tight group, and that made Dugin angry. And it took a long time, decades, until occultism became a bigger movement, and Dugin finally got what he wanted, an international movement of this stuff. And
But by the way, it's interesting that it is generally thought that Menjinsky, who was Felix Dzerzhinsky's deputy, thought up Operation Trust, thought up the creation of a fake. I mean, he was extremely important as a KGB, or at that time, Cheka or GPU strategist. So that's important. And so the idea of creating controlled opposition, and this is something that is, when you're talking about inversions and perversions, controlled opposition is you transform the nature. One of the formulas of Marxism is to destroy things by changing their nature, and also in occultism. And you have this in the 1980s, the KGB intentionally infiltrating neo-Nazi groups very intensively. Tremendous efforts were made to synthesize far-right ideas to exploit their anti-Western properties for some future purpose. Because remember, the Soviet Union was planning to kind of go away, but under the surface, this was allowing them this other. So the right, the neo-Nazi right, and the far right in general is just 1,000 splinters. Well, the KGB was asking itself in the 1980s, if you look at the literature and what it says, is how do we bring all these splinters together into one, and then how do we merge it with communism? At some future date. And I think that's what we're on the verge of seeing right now, because it's obviously, I've noticed this for almost 2 decades. I've been expecting this. I've been expecting the right to back Moscow for what we're seeing, the AfD party, or what's happening with MAGA. I've been expecting this because I've seen the intellectual preparation for it. If you really are paying attention to the communists and to the Russians, you can see that they've been working on this a long time off and on. And this left-right convergence strategy, which of course takes years or decades to develop, its culmination is shown in Putin reaching out to the far right. Thus we get, Carlson's interview, the only interview that Putin has given since the war began 2 years ago in Ukraine. He's given it to this right-wing American, and it's this playing to the right. And it's no accident then that Dugin's fourth political theory attempts to ideologically combine the themes of the right and the left by focusing on the enemies of both, which is classical Western liberal center.
Yeah, and Dugin
and real Christianity, right?
Yeah, Dugin is tied to this Konstantin Malofeyev guy, who's very high ranking, and he's been involved in financing fighters. Apparently, he's on a sanctions list now. Stuff that happened in Ukraine, years ago. And so there's emails leaked, or this happens almost every couple of months. So some emails get leaked where you can see that Dugin is working with Konstantin Malofeyev, who is a fan of the Tsars, and they are inviting AfD party members and others to these special meetings. And they're inviting these French politicians, they're inviting these Italians who love Putin, apparently. And you always get this, there's always occultism in it. You know, the Italians, they're into Julius Evola, and they're into everything. So this is sort of the network that has been built for a long time. And nowadays you see in Germany demonstrations where you have a mixed crowd. These extreme right-wingers and communists and esoterics, and some of these journalists are scratching their head. They can't figure out why these people would actually function together. But if you look at Helena Blavatsky, for example, Helena Blavatsky started this movement which then at a later stage branched out to target not just a right-wing audience but also a left-wing audience. And also it became popular in Britain. Again, Britain and its weird links to the Russians. So all these people, Pyotr Uspensky, George Gurdjieff, there's all these connections. Uspensky's lectures in London were attended by people such as Aldous Huxley, T.S. Eliot, Gerald Heard, and others. Lady Rothermere, the wife of Harold Harmsworth, the first Viscount Rothermere, a press magnate, was willing to promote Tertium Organum, one of the texts from either Uspensky or Gurdjieff. And in Istanbul, Gurdjieff also met his future pupil, Captain John Bennett, the then head of the British Directorate of Military Intelligence in Constantinople. So there's always this weirdo connection to the Brits, and then they get into America, where we talked about this before. When I met the retired two-star general Albert Stubblebine, right, who was always a military intelligence professional, very much an anti-communist, and he was so frustrated after Vietnam because all these young soldiers died and he couldn't figure out why it went so bad. Only later did the moles get exposed, responsible for that. So Stubblebine was depressed, and then he gets into these circles from these people, Aldous Huxley and others, and these circles, they try to get into the American military and get these people, get them into most likely psychedelic drugs. I mean, I believe that Albert Stubblebine took psychedelic drugs because he was depressed. And then he gets into all this stuff. They called it the First Earth Battalion, creating these rainbow warriors, going through walls and all of this stuff. They try to get into everything, literally everything.
Well, you know, it's interesting with Dugin. All this occultism, you know, boils down to the blood, the killing, the destruction. And so Dugin, as the ultimate black magician in Russia, ultimately has become an advocate of war. And he likes to quote Heraclitus in saying that war is the father of all things. But there's some more quotes from Dugin's works, and I'm going to quote a couple of these things in the context of this. Getting people to use drugs is a way of poisoning their brains, right? He says, if the European New Right chooses us, the Russians, that means it chooses the barbarian element, and therefore it must choose our methods of action, which are, of course, extreme violence. And then Dugin explained, you must take a knife, put on a mask, and
kill
have you
someone,
heard this quote before?
And just kill
Go
someone
out
on the street
of the house in the evening and kill at least one Yank. Kill at least one Yank, okay? And then he added, I do not know whether any of the new right activists have ever been under artillery siege, but our people do not only go to meetings and fight at barricades, they also go to real wars. For instance, in the Dniester district, Moldova, or Yugoslavia. The new right is only a project. We are its architects. The future truly is ours. So Dugin is saying the new right is our project. We have created it.
Yeah.
It's adopting the Russian formula of violence. And then he said, and he got in trouble in 2014 when the the Euromaidan revolution happened, he said, "Today's Ukrainians are a race of degenerates. They crawled up from the sewer. Genocide is in order." This is what Dugin said. And then he said,
Yeah.
"Kill, kill, and kill Ukrainians. We must kill all Ukrainians."
Yeah, I mean,
And this is
we get
quoted
so
by
many
Iser.
we get so many Ukrainian refugees. This started when the war started, and you would, I mean, in my little town here, you would go out on the street and you would hear people talk Ukrainian, and if you look closely, you can tell they're Ukrainian, but it's like they look like most people here. So for the Russians, the Ukrainians are too white, and this is something that the Americans need to understand. Now, this whole new right wing thing in Europe is virulently anti-American. Okay, so I used to get hate mail because of my pronunciation, because I have American relatives, because we sell American brands. I'm wearing American clothing, by the way. This is 511. This is 511 Tactical. This is an American clothing brand that we sell. So we get a lot of hate mail for that, and I keep telling people, so many Americans have German roots. Like 40 to 50 million Americans have German roots. What are you talking about? But it's so crazy anti-American, and it's people have really no idea about Russia. In this day and age, I asked my mother recently. She's about 66 years old. I'm 40. So I asked her, tell me, how did you follow this whole Cold War thing back then? And my mother said, I didn't pay that much attention. And so that made me think, because I was born in 1984, so I was a little kid in the 80s, the height of the Cold War. Had I been born in 1974, I would only have been a teenager in the 80s, so I wouldn't really have noticed much about the Cold War. If I had been born in 1964, I would have been a full adult at the height of the Cold War. And then I needed to read books. I really needed to get into this topic. So nowadays in Germany, you're either too young to have experienced the Cold War, and if you're at least 60 years old, you needed to actually get into this consciously. So now we have 3 generations of Germans that have absolutely no idea about Russia and the Cold War. You were either too young
Just
back
like
then.
Tucker Carlson has no idea.
And in 1989, the wall came down, so people stopped caring altogether. Why should we get into this?
Yeah.
Why should we learn about the KGB and the Soviets and the moles and everything? Why should we care? It's over. So people stopped caring altogether. So we have 3 generations of people. People in their 60s and older. My generation, I'm 40 now. Now we have the 20-year-olds who are adults now. Nobody knows anything about Russia, let alone the crazy stuff.
During the Cold War, I remember during the Cold War being in graduate school and saying, Russia, this is in a graduate seminar, saying the Soviet Union is a dangerous enemy of the United States. And this man, a fellow graduate school in his mid-20s, became enraged, put his face right up against my face and screamed at me, "You're insane," at the top of his lungs, right in my ear and my face. Wow. And all I said was that this was just, so to give you an idea, was to be a Cold Warrior, even during the Cold War, was controversial and considered not right in polite society. So it was even amazing that we could uphold our defenses even then. Because you remember in the 70s, after Watergate, and after they dragged the CIA through the mud, and they called our soldiers, came back from Vietnam and called them baby killers. I remember being a Marine in training in Virginia, being in a restaurant with all my buddies on liberty from training, and we had to get up and leave the restaurant because they were calling us baby killers. This is 1978. Yeah. This is 3 years after the fall of Saigon. They were still calling us baby killers, right? Yeah. So this was the whole way it worked back then. People don't realize, and of course we let our military go to the point that Russia was tempted to nuke us off the map back in the early 80s.
And imagine at that time, what would the truthers have said to you and your guys? They would have told you, you are a tool of the globalist Jewish banker conspiracy. You went to Vietnam because of the Jews or something. So it's not just the left.
Like Tucker Carlson saying it now when he was on with Lex Fridman, and appalling, by the way, what a vacuous man Carlson is. I mean, he is so empty. He says to Lex Fridman, "Oh," and he said it more than once, "so many people have made money off this war." The Rothschilds? Are you talking about? I mean, what does that mean? What does that have to do with the Ukrainians suffering this invasion? This is ridiculous. I hope somebody makes money and gives them lots of really good weapons, right? To stop the evil of this invasion. But no, that's his vacuous statement.
I mean, I would like to see
insane. Yeah.
I would like, I mean, maybe someday we'll find out why exactly the CIA refused the application of Tucker Carlson back then. Could it be that he was into LSD, maybe? That he was into these probably crazy circles?
Smoking marijuana.
These crazy circles of music, 60s music and all alternative will make everything new and all that stuff.
Grateful Dead, come on.
What, was that the reason the CIA refused him outright? Or was it the dyslexia, so he can't read? I don't, what?
Well, if you've seen the whole Lex Fridman interview with Carlson says, "I don't know why NATO exists. We need to get out of it right away." Does he understand? Let me, just for the audience to explain this, how destructive this is, how stupid this is. If the U.S. got out of NATO, NATO would collapse. Russia would own Europe. It would just be a fact. Because our nuclear umbrella would no longer protect them. They would have no real protection and no real support. And if that happened, same thing would happen to Japan and the South Korea and Australia and the Pacific. So we'd be all alone, because Latin America's gone with Russia and China. So we'd be all alone. And by the way, no one would use the dollar as a trading currency. So trillions of dollars that are being used as trading currency around the world would come flooding back to the United States. And the hyperinflation would make what happened in Germany in the 20s look like nothing.
I mean,
our economy would be leveled immediately. Stupid idiot.
According to Truth or Logic, America is an occupied country, and the occupiers are the elders of Zion. So we need help to liberate.
Zog.
Yeah, exactly. So we need Russian help to liberate the United States. So in Truth or Logic, it makes absolute sense that Russia takes over Western Europe, gets access to all the German, especially the German industry, and then uses that enlarged empire to then take over America. But in Truth or Logic, that would be a liberation. If people talk about, the Illuminati and all that stuff that they don't really understand because they don't know German history and European history, when they talk about the Illuminati, what do these truthers actually believe these Russian guys are doing in their palaces? I mean, have you seen these palaces, the old ones and the new ones they built? What do you think they're into? I mean, all this, ancient stuff and occult stuff, that's what they love. And you want these people to...
I will quote Dugin again. "The new right is only a project, and we are its architects."
Exactly. We made
hear
this.
that, Carlson?
And they
hear that?
And they say this was also Dugin, I believe. He was talking about Europe becoming a protectorate of Russia. Now, is this what the truthers have in mind? Really? I mean, is that it? And even in
read Archaeofuturism,
even in the communist,
the book by Fay.
Yeah, I mean, and the
where
truthers,
Moscow becomes the capital of Europe.
And the truthers, basically, the conspiracy movement, they believe that Satanism and occultism and mystery cults, they believe this is Jewish, right? As if Jews had invented this, or they've invented a special something or whatever. This is, the czars were into the occult, the communists were into the occult, and in the post, Soviet phase, there's more occult. These occultists are supposed to help you to liberate yourself from occultists. Am I missing something here? No, the film director, the famous film director, Sergei Eisenstein. Now, he basically invented modern cinema, propagandistic cinema. And the Nazis learned from this guy. All the Leni Riefenstahl movies. You can watch Leni Riefenstahl movies about the Nazis. You can watch them on YouTube, and even the bigger Hitler speeches. They all took this stuff from the Soviets. And so film director Sergei Eisenstein was a Rosicrucian, and more members of the art scene in the Soviet Union, they were all occultists. They were in the same lodges, and there were other orders of that nature. And it became a more broad phenomenon in the Soviet Union when Stalin died. But then Brezhnev introduced stricter measures again against these occult groups, so they wanted to keep it in a tight circle. And so then there was this underground movement, people like Dugin. They were not so high yet in the hierarchy at that point, because Dugin was young at some point. He was angry. He wanted to partake in this elite occultism, so he was part of the underground. And these people, the circle that Dugin was in, they almost drank themselves to death. They tried most likely all kinds of drugs. They tried to be that thing.
They were members of that circle who died doing some of their crazy ritual stuff.
And so then this Pamyat movement came along that you mentioned, and they were very right-wing, very conspiracy-minded, and so that made them compatible to Western circles. And so this is already...
And by the way, it's interesting, they made them compatible to Western circles, but the KGB, the Central Committee, and the Soviet Army were behind this Pamyat project.
Exactly.
Isn't that interesting?
So now we see Tucker Carlson interviewing Putin. Putin plays the Tsar, but he also sneaks in communist, Leninist arguments and narratives. And so this was the early, the Pamyat era, this was the early infiltration of the Western, or an additional infiltration of the Western conspiracy movement. Because, if you view the Gilded Age of American industrialism, if you think of that as a Jewish conspiracy, then everything is a conspiracy. Xerox is a conspiracy. The steel companies are a conspiracy. The oil, the cars, everything is a conspiracy. So you have to fight everything. You have to fight it all. And the banks, everything, government, everything is a conspiracy. Everything is occupation. And you have to rise up and be a rebel and just destroy this system. This was the truthers, and this was also what the Russians were saying. And it's baffling to me that it wasn't obvious to people in America with the Birch movement, the John Birch Society. They claim to be the best anti-communist group on earth. Nobody was better than them, they said. And but they were attacking Eisenhower? Like, what? What?
Well, it's worse than that. They were fingering the capitalist elite as the real enemy, right? The insiders. Well, the Jewish bankers, it comes down to it, but they wouldn't say that because they didn't want to be labeled as neo-Nazis or anti-Semites. So Robert Welch was careful about that. But if you read Revlo Oliver's memoir, Revlo Oliver basically says in his memoir that he and Robert Welch believed in the same thing, which was that the Jews were the problem, right? And he said Welch wouldn't come out and say it. He would hide that fact. He would claim to be that he was not anti-Semitic. But so Revlo Oliver famously in his memoir calls Robert Welch the Welcher, Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society. You find that Robert Welch employed people like Willis Carto, the famous anti-Semite neo-Nazi American publisher. Willis Carto, who published Francis Parker Yockey's Imperium, which was dedicated to Adolf Hitler, the hero of the Second World War, right? Had Taylor Caldwell writing for him, an Irish-American novelist, anti-Semite, would take the stage with Westbrook Pegler, another American anti-Semite journalist. It's the associations of Robert Welch spell it out pretty clearly. But then when you get to where I met the head of the John Birch Society, the president of the John Birch Society, who told me that it was a Jewish conspiracy of 9 Jewish Kabbalists who rule the world through the banks and the Illuminati. And this was the president of the John Birch Society 30 years ago telling me this. When I'm having coffee and pie with him at a friend's house, I just thought, this is just insane.
Yeah.
But you see, this far right, the Russians, the KGB realize this far right, this neo-Nazi right. See, what people think is Nazism, like communism, it doesn't die because it's an idea. And there's always people around the world who have the romance of this idea, that somehow are obsessed with it. And so if you can just energize those people, unite with them, revive them into networks, and then create a movement, and then draw the center away into the far right, into the far left, destroy the center, then you've got your scissors strategy. You've got the right and the left being under your control, and then you can destroy the whole. So
post-Soviet Union, well, at least on paper, when the Soviet Union formally was over, this is when you saw an explosion of occultism in Russia, former Soviet territories. So this was huge. Okay, this was the time that Dugin had been waiting for to create this big international movement. This is when books started to appear everywhere. Everybody could access everything, and then came, of course, the internet. Everybody could access this stuff, and so Aleister Crowley's writings became very popular again in Russia. There were OTO lodges in Russia. A guy named Yuri Nikitin wrote novels similar to Tolkien, but with more occultism in it. Maria Semyonova sold 80,000 copies of Wolfhound, a novel which was turned into a very, very expensive movie in Russia. Then you had the black metal movement. This was all over the 90s, mainly Scandinavia, but there was always sympathies for older stuff and Russian stuff. So black metal is a genre which is overtly Satanist. Now, this is not like the older rock bands that would just play with the imagery to provoke people. They were really into Satanism. So you had all these bands making music, and they would always put stuff in it that was old. The old mythologies, and that stuff became really big in the 1990s. So people in Russia, they would travel to sites like Arkheim in the southern Urals. They call it the Russian Stonehenge, thought to be the home of the Aryans. The Times of London wrote in 2018, there are 800,000 occultists and faith healers in Russia, but only 640,000 doctors. So you get this shamanic folk medicine everywhere. You can pay people to perform rituals, so you can get a promotion, or you could prevent accidents, and that sort of, that way of thinking. And this was Dugin's moment. This was really Dugin's time. Immediately in the 1990s, he started to network with European politicians, and he was already calling for the merge of the right and the left. And I remember this book from the 1990s. This was written by two communists. One now runs one of the most influential alternative magazines, which is very pro-Russia in Germany here. It's very pro-Dugin. They interviewed him multiple times. And the other author was a communist woman named Sarah Wagenknecht, and she just started a new political party, and she's also very, very pro-Russia. And so these two people in 1996, they talked about how can we get communism back, or how can we do something, to help Russia. And she was already advocating for national Bolshevism, which was Dugin's concept of merging communist elements with nationalist elements. She was already on to the next thing, while this other guy, Jürgen Elsässer, he was not yet into national Bolshevism. Now he is. So they were quick to seize the opportunities in the 1990s. Dugin was into everything. He was into Julius Evola, whose book Pagan Imperialism he translated into Russian. Now that sounds creepy already. Pagan Imperialism. Then, of course, the association with the Pamyat movement. And Dugin co-founded, of course, the National Bolshevik Party with Eduard Limonov, who went to New York, actually. And Limonov, he was moving around in America, and his New York acquaintances included Studio 54's Steve Rubel and a Trotskyite group, the Socialist Workers' Party. Now, Steve Rubel was the co-owner of the New York City disco Studio 54, and Rubel hired Roy Cohn to defend his people in court. And so that's here on a side note. And Dugin left the National Bolshevik Party in 1998, and then he created new projects and I think even a new party. Publishing his Foundations of Geopolitics in 1997, and the Waffen-SS and the Ahnenerbe, he called it an intellectual oasis in the framework of the National Socialist regime. So why would he call it an oasis within the Nazi system? Because apparently the Nazis were not occult enough in a broad sense to him, because the Nazis kept the really crazy stuff in a tight circle. It was the Waffen-SS and the Ahnenerbe which were really cool to him. Because Germany at the time, it was oftentimes a very drab place. So you didn't have many spots in nature that would, sparkle your imagination. It was very industrialized and it was very drab. But the Ahnenerbe was cool to him, and the Waffen-SS, they were creating the warrior elite of the future, they thought. And so you had to be specifically chosen for that organization, especially in terms of your family. Now, if you were any regular German and you wanted to marry, you would have to prove who your ancestors were. We even found some of these old Ahnenpässe in our records. Our ancestors, they had to prove several generations back that they were worthy of having children. So they had to background check you several generations backwards. And Dugin was working with the French the Belgian guys, Jean-François Thiriart. They talked about a Euro-Soviet empire which would stretch from Dublin to Vladivostok and would also expand to the south.
Yeah, that's the old Eurasianist. I mean, that's what Gorbachev called the one common European home. Gorbachev, the Leninist. What's also interesting is in response to the Tucker Carlson interview, Dugin put a big post on X. And in that post, he said that Tucker Carlson was a symbolic figure. And he said that he is now the main symbol of the America that hates Biden, liberals, and globalists and is preparing to vote for Trump. And then what Dugin says is that Trump, Carlson, and Musk, plus Texas Governor Abbott, are the faces of the looming American revolution, this time a conservative revolution. So claims this fraud, this black magician, this stooge of the KGB.
And Dugin was a guest on the Alex Jones show, and Alex Jones was a guest on a program with Dugin, I think multiple times. And
yes.
and Alex Jones, I mean, in his earlier days, in the 90s and the early 2000s, Alex Jones was trashing David Icke. He didn't want anything to do in public with, the reptilians and, multi-dimensional beings and all that stuff. But over the years, Alex Jones became a fan of David Icke, and he would also talk repeatedly about the drug DMT, which became popular in the internet age because you could order it online on these illegal marketplaces, sort of like an eBay hidden in the deep web or the dark web, where you have these different listings of drugs, and you can just pick some stuff, put it in your virtual basket, and then pay in Bitcoin or whatever, and then you would get it via postal service. And so I think that Jones still denies that he has taken DMT or something like that, but he keeps talking about it. And he also talked on the Joe Rogan podcast how he would get these hallucinations before he sleeps, and he talks about all this stuff. So we can speculate that Alex Jones might have taken psychedelics and has become a part of that broader scene of Tucker Carlson and Jordan Peterson, and also some of these older guys, or these people from the 9/11 Truth movement who became sort of famous in the 2000s. Some of them are signaling they're into psychedelics. And there was this one guy, Adam Kokesh. He had a show on Russia Today, and he was promoting Ron Paul, who was very pro-Russia. And this Adam Kokesh guy, he would promote DMT on his YouTube channel when it was still somewhat tolerated there. And I think there was even a video of Kokesh, well, using some sort of substance and letting people watch him experiencing that. And so this became a thing. And so they do this, and the audience, which believes everything they say anyway, the audience may get into this, and this is exactly what Dugin wants. This is what Jordan Peterson is talking about, that people get back in touch with the mysterious and the nature and these grander concepts, and you're supposed to hate everything that's modern and left-wing and whatever. And so you create this network of people, you create this movement, and they're also expected to use these drugs and to read what Dugin is saying. Now, Dugin was talking about how the modern person has a normal job and he's on his phone and he watches movies and television, but you're supposed to be the opposite. You should withdraw from this general world. You should take these drugs and go into the forest and perform some ritual and then go out with a knife and kill somebody, basically.
Mac the knife, It's
creating
that's the thing. Yeah.
Creating a terrorist movement. And it's interesting to see that when Dugin is such a fan of the SS and the Ahnenerbe, I mean, this directly plays into the hands of the left in America, because the left is watching what the right is doing, and they're looking at this and they're saying, this is completely insane Nazi stuff. So that emboldens the communists to be even more active and more crazy when they see that. So this is galvanizing the left. They want to have their own revolution because they think they have to preempt the right wing. When people start talking about a civil war, this was on all these shows out there, talking about civil war, and more civil war. This is exactly what Dugin wants and his GRU people want. I mean, it's so obvious to us, but we know Soviet history, we know the Cold War inside out. To us, it's very, very clear, but these people like Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones, apparently they have very little idea about, the Eastern Bloc, and very little idea about the Cold War. Even if they market themselves as experts.
This whole thing, Del Noce, in his book, it talks about modern violence and violence for its own sake being the political rule that came through Nazism and communism in the 20th century. And this is a theme that needs to be expounded on. But again, I'll end this with, again, quoting Aleister Crowley, saying that the blood is life. And sacrificing to dark entities, what these entities want is a perfect male child, maybe 5 years old, something like that.
A smart boy.
A smart, attractive boy. Yeah, and that this is the most pleasing sacrifice that could be made. But I'll read this again about his one last word on this subject. This is Aleister Crowley now, writing in the book Magic in Theory and Practice. This is from book 4. There is a magical operation of maximum importance The initiation of a new aeon. When it becomes necessary to utter a word, the whole planet must be bathed in blood.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it's all about. The ritual human sacrifice, massacring people, drawing magical circles, doing these crazy metaphysical, dark, mimicry, where they make political actions into like a giant ritual. And in fact, when you look at someone like the political philosopher and sometime theologian Eric Voegelin saying, "Look, this is dark stuff. These people, Marx is like a magician. Hegel is a magician." He says they are conjuring with their intellectual, philosophical lies and deceptions and tricks. He calls them tricks. They're tricksters. And they are creating something that's very evil, and they know they're doing it. They know they're lying. And this is the same thing with Hitler. Hitler knew he was lying. He knew he was tricking people, you know. And of course, what ended up happening? Your country, Germany, was destroyed. It was just leveled. The Allied bombers, between the Allied bombers and the Soviet army coming in, everything was just incinerated.
Yeah.
Berlin, the artillery, the Russian artillery was just bouncing the rubble at one point. How many people died? How many Germans? 9 million Germans died in World War II, and half of them died in the last 3-4 months of the war. 4.5 million people, because it was just a slaughter at the end. Just a slaughter. And it was foreseeable.
Yeah.
It was foreseeable. Yeah. Tiny Germany, against the United States and the Soviet Union and the British Empire.
Good luck with that, yeah.
How is that going to turn out?
Good luck with that, yeah. Yeah, it's like it's these people. I mean, there's many people now in America. They make minimum wage. They're young men in fighting age, right? They're the typical age of a soldier. And they're constantly being told that you live in an occupied system, an occupied country, and you have nothing to lose because your life expectation is to keep working minimum wage, to be treated like that, and so you can be part of something great. You can be part of something special. It's better to fight for this weirdo revolution than to live as a slave, and all this stuff that was used so many times before in various countries, and now they have figured out the Americans because Russia and China, they stole all the data on Americans, online data on social media, what people like to hear, what they believe. They have their people in psychology, so they know how the American family works and how the American mind works. So they're telling you what you want to hear. And they're merging it with Americana. They're merging this nonsense with, George Washington and the spirit of 1776. I mean, and they sell it to you that way. They package it in a way that you like. Because even people that consider themselves American patriots, they know not enough about American history, and they do not know about the other forces back in those days, how the French needed to sell stuff to the American rebels, and and some of the stuff that happened right after the revolution, because the British, they ceased military operations, but they continued the intelligence war indefinitely. So you have old British networks in America, and the British are compromised, with the Russians. So,
well, to get back to the new right and this whole thing, I will quote Dugin one more time. The new right is a project, and we are its architects. And who's we? The Academy of Sciences, the KGB, the Russian strategic structures, the Chinese are participating in this. So anyway, it's been an interesting ride. We've covered a lot about this occult in Russia and how all of this fits together. The one place you can resolve all these seemingly contradictory strands, because how can you how can you basically reconcile these opposites, the far right, the far left, communism, atheistic communism, and the occult? It all is reconciled in strategy, because it is in strategy that it unfolds as an attempt at conquest, which is really what they're after. They're after power. So, Alex, I want to thank you. I want to thank the listeners for being with us. I'm Jeff Nyquist in America. My friend here was Alex Benesch in Germany. And we want you to join us next time for another episode. Thank you for being with us today.